Anyway, life is getting more difficult for Spain. I'm not sure when it's been good recently, and the situation for the Eurozone more perilous. Last night, the credit rating agency Standard & Poor's downgraded Spanish bonds or government IOUs to BBB-, or just above junk status. This morning, the markets have reacted, and it's got more expensive for Spain to borrow money. But what do these credit ratings agencies actually know? And have we all become slaves to the financial markets? This man thinks so.
Loving bankers need to be dragged out on the streets and bloody shafted. The bloody bankers, they're responsible for the food banks. This bloody shower of a government is out prostituting itself for the bloody bankers.
Yep, the Vox Populi, the omniscient London taxi. It's absurd to think that the period of banker bashing has come to a close because we have not even begun to bash the bankers. We will fight them in the trenches. We will fight them. We're going to bash it. It haven't even started yet, Stacey Herbert. How dare they say it's time to stop them? It's absurd.
Makes our programme seem quite quiet, doesn't it? And the star of the Keiser report. Strangely enough, he's called Max Keiser. He joins us now.
We take our inspiration from you, Andrew.
You really?
Yes, you're the template we try to follow.
Oh, dear. There goes
Drink
my...
a lot of Blue Nun as well.
There goes my chance of contract renewal. Other than the Soviet Union, give me a society or a system that works without bankers.
Well, you saw some great pushback against bankers in Iceland. You know, the bankers took over that country. They got the country into deep trouble, and they effectively pushed back against the bankers, and they had a economic downturn, and now they're recovering. So they
still got banks.
They've effectively... Sure. The problem is not banking per se, but too big to fail banks. Banks that are over-concentrated. Oh. Part of the crisis of 2008 is that the too big to fail banks got even bigger. So we have fewer of these institutions.
So Iceland's the best you can do.
Well, it's a great example of... You asked me for an example. There's a contemporary example.
No, I've seen it. I'm not arguing with you.
Unfortunately, it's a global problem that's infested countries all over the world, and we don't have a lot of great examples.
We may not like them, but we need banks, don't we?
No, but the banking institutions are a necessary part of running society, no doubt. But when you have too big to fail banks, when you have bankers engaging in wholesale fraud, when you have bankers engaging in manipulation, when you have bankers engaging in insider trading. I mean, this country here in London, you've just come out of the LIBOR scandal and various other scandals. London and the City of London is kind of the most regulatory lax environment in the world. You had AIG come through London, Lehman Brothers come through London, MF Global come through London. All these scandals come through London because they have very lax banking standards. And that's one thing I think the Prime Minister should address in his lofty speech. He should address this issue to get rid of some of these guys who are making it very difficult.
And whether or not we need banks, and we probably do need banks, the record of the banks in recent years has been quite appalling. Just when you think it's going to get better, some other mis-selling or LIBOR scandal or moving the money of the Mexican drug cartels or helping finance the Iranian government against sanctions. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
Yes, it's been catastrophic. The real question is, why were these catastrophic decisions made? Why was there this huge bubble? Why was there this huge cluster of errors made by bankers and financial services? And there's two possible explanations to that. The first is that it's a spontaneous outcome when you have banks and capitalism. The second is, and that's my view, that the markets were horribly distorted, both by very lax and ridiculous monetary policy and also by ridiculous guarantees from governments and intervention and this idea that big banks would be bailed out and this idea that the Federal Reserve would always step in if the financial markets went down and this concept that risk was dead. And I think those two factors were the dominant cause of the financial crisis.
Well, we have some common views here in terms of monetary policy has been a catastrophe, but banks have been... it's not a spontaneous eruption of fraud. I mean, there's more premeditation going on because somehow bankers continue to book enormous bonuses every year. They're not the ones who are suffering in all of this. So I don't think it's a spontaneous combustion. But the monetary policies are definitely to point to that. There's regulatory loopholes and frauds. It's something that must be looked at closely, but the monetary policy encourages what in the industry is called moral hazard. The Fed, the Bank of England, they keep giving the banks cheap money, free money.
Which
they're not lending it out.
Also, exactly. Yeah, I agree, and that's a massive government failure.
I can't believe you two are agreeing.
When it comes to
we
fraud,
have to put an end to this.
I know this is very dangerous. When it comes to fraud, there has been an absolutely massive error in the UK, which is that fraud in finance or in business in general wasn't prosecuted heavily enough compared to the way it was in other countries. But I think what we saw in the case of the epidemic of fraud was what J.K. Galbraith described as bezel. It's the
bezels,
absolutely.
Which you saw when the tide went out.
Exactly. So when there's a bubble, nobody cares.
Yes.
Nobody looks for the fraud and the crime. Everybody's happy. When there's a recession, everybody starts looking under, every stone and so on, and finds all the horrible things that were happening before.
Sure. We saw the housing market. The housing market booms. People say, well, look the other way because my house is going up. I can borrow against my house. Now the housing market collapses. And they go, wait a minute, there's a lot of problems here. So
the point is, this kind of thing happens everywhere. For example, there was a massive pharmaceutical scandal recently with a big pharmaceutical company having to pay a huge fine to America. It didn't even make the front page of newspapers. But because we're so focused on banks, rightly, we are exposing scandals in banking. That has to stop, of course. It has to be
and let's
prosecuted.
focus on this new regulator, Martin Wheatley, who's come in. They're getting rid of the FSA. They're bringing in a new regulatory agency. He is saying that we're going to start prosecuting crimes in the future, which I think is they should start to look at the crimes that are still seething in the present. And look at these more closely. So they bring in a new regulator. It's the old bait and switch. It's the let's bring in a new guy, out with the old, in with the new, try to deflect attention. And Martin Wheatley, so far, hasn't demonstrated. If he wanted to do something about these banksters, as some call them, he would look for...
You call them.
Many call them banksters. It's a term that goes back
We just heard you.
Well, there you go. I'll take credit for that term. If I'll be more than happy to do so.
I just wanted to
he should be looking for those Icelandic bankers in the city of London with Interpol is looking for them.
So
Martin Wheatley.
Iceland's the way ahead?
Actually, I think that the way ahead is to treat banks much more like other kinds of businesses and make sure that failure in banking is punished in the same way as it's punished in other industries with bankruptcy and with loss. You can't nationalise losses but privatise profits. And so you need to find new ways of allowing even the biggest banks to be wound down and to go bankrupt.
But what would
gently.
be the effect on the population at large who've got savings and investments in those banks?
Exactly. And that you've got to protect that, but you've got to make sure that the bondholders, who are the ones really bailed out to the tune of tens of billions of dollars in this crisis, pay the price. And there's ways of doing this. There's ways of doing this that people have been working on. I think that is the most important point. You need to have real capitalism in banking, not the pseudo-rigged markets we've seen in recent years.
Haven't we all just become too dependent on the financial markets? Because we all borrow so much. As individuals, we borrow a lot. As governments, we borrow as never before. We wouldn't have to be in hock to these guys if we lived within our own means.
Well, I mean, that's true. Banks make money by putting people in hock. This is their primary source of revenue. And you see this both on an individual level, with the pushing of credit cards continuously, but you also see it at a regional level and a sovereign level. This is what's the problem of the Eurozone, is that these countries were forced into these huge debt positions, particularly in Greece. Greece was encouraged to enormous debts right before joining the euro from their friendly banker down on Wall Street.
Well, so the banks made them do it, as opposed to just greedy Greek politicians.
To say, you can fudge the rules by not complying to the Maastricht Treaty, according to Goldman Sachs, who was down there, well-known, documented.
Sure, but the politicians went along with that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't buy this idea that borrowers are powerless people who are, who have to borrow. I think people...
They made me do it.
Yes, I think there's misbuying, there's misselling.
Of tainted meat. You need some consumer protections. When you're selling bad debts that are exploding in people's faces.
Politicians borrowed too much because they were stupid. They made terrible mistakes. They joined the euro. It was the fault of the politicians.
All right, I knew I could get the two of you to disagree.
Who funds the politicians? The banksters.
They do?
The banksters.
Who supports? Who's the biggest contributor to the re-election campaigns in the U.S.? The banks, Wall Street.
But that's the U.S. That's the U.S., not the UK.
David Cameron's very, very friendly with the City of London.
Don't go away. We don't want to lose you.
Okay, let's stick.
I don't know why you were worried about the lack of agreement or lack of disagreement.
I just took my while to get around to it.